Welcome to Founders Corner. This show is all about sharing impactful lessons for entrepreneurs from brilliant minds who have lived and learned through the startup journey and built amazing companies. This podcast is from Omidyar Network's emerging technology team, who invest in early-stage startups that aim to build great for-profit businesses that can change the world and create impact at scale. On today's episode, we have Jeremy Johnson, the co-founder and CEO of Andela. Andela works with some of the biggest companies in the world to connect them with talent from Africa to hire amazing software engineers. Jeremy discusses what it was like to start Andela and the early pivot the company went through to get to where they are today. You'll learn about the company's approach to hiring and to building a company that is mission-driven, but still squarely focused on solving challenges for their clients. Now let's get started with host and Omidyar Network investing partner, Rob Veris.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Founders Corner. I'm Rob Veris. I'm here on a beautiful day in New York City, visiting with Jeremy Johnson, CEO and co-founder of Andela. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So, Jeremy, we at Omidyar know what Andela is, obviously, but for our listeners, could you explain?
You've been an important part of the story.
Could you explain to the rest of the audience what is Andela?
Yeah, Andela actually started out of a pretty simple belief, and that's brilliance is relatively evenly distributed around the world. Opportunity looks a little bit different. What Andela does is find and then catalyze the careers for top technology leaders or aspiring developers from around the continent of Africa, and help not just connect them with top-tier companies, but also give them the exposure and experience needed to thrive as leaders both in their countries, but also around the world. We are, considered by, or we've been called a bunch of times like the Rhodes Scholarship meets Pivotal Labs for Africa. And so it's a very selective program. We accept about 0.7% of applicants, and those people take part in a 4-year technical leadership program that has them spending most of the first year working on internal projects with Andela, and then the next 3 years working with top-tier engineering firms around the world as full-time members of, some of the most challenging engineering environments anywhere.
So I'd love to hear more about how things got started. Did you envision from the get-go everything that Andela is today and the business model and the placements and the whole training cycle? Which pieces were there in the beginning, and then sort of where did you start?
So I was actually at Andela's Nairobi campus last week, and a number of the developers were asking this exact question. No good idea starts fully formed. It's just not how the world works. There are certainly parts of Andela that have been very consistent throughout. I'd say, someone who spent their life in startups, Andela has been much more consistent than any other, which, quite frankly, worries me a little bit. But the core of it, we're going to leverage really high-quality education technology to elevate the next generation of technical leaders. That's been very consistent. That said, you go back to the very beginning, my initial, the idea, my initial conception of it was that we were going to leverage this approach to ed tech, but we were going to create a sort of algorithm to mine like Elance and Odesk as a way to pull down jobs from the cloud as the way to fund and scale it. That was a terrible idea in retrospect. What we learned is that it actually took more time to get the individual jobs than to do them, and it just wasn't scalable. And this is someone who's spent most of their life in startups. Like, it was a terrible idea. But I also am on the board of startup here in New York that's venture-backed, scaling pretty quickly, and like every other high-growth startup in the country, struggling to find engineers. And the CEO asked me at one meeting, he's like, "Hey, I need a Node.js developer. I'm really struggling here. Anyone have any thoughts or recommendations?" And I said, "You know what? I got an idea. I might be able to help you with this." And we had one of our actually, first cohorts, one of the developer from one of the first cohorts, apprentice initially under one of our, lead developers, and worked with a few months in that capacity, and then take it on himself, and it went incredibly well. We were able to effectively transition and bring on this developer for them that then ended up being a critical team member for the next couple of years, like a core part of their team. But doing that from Lagos, Nigeria, Shane Martin was his name, and it was his hometown. That's something that most people would have looked at and said, like, that's crazy. There's no way this would work. And he, once a year came to visit the U.S. and spent time on site, but otherwise operated in a distributed fashion. And that was it created a huge boost for that company. They really needed someone great, and he was exactly that. But it also helped open up our eyes to, wait a second, you know what? Maybe we don't think of this as micro tasks. Maybe given just how talented the individuals are, what if we were to think about this more as more of a fully, embedded model? And that's a way better idea. But we wouldn't have realized that if we hadn't started somewhere and hadn't learned from trying.
And you realized that after your first cohort had sort of started work.
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah, we were, probably 8 months into the company at that point.
And so, speaking of that first cohort, I mean, you came in with the belief in the fact that talent's evenly distributed, but you still have to identify it.
Mm-hmm.
How did you set about to do that?
What most people look for is where an individual is right now. They look for dots. Lines are way more interesting. What you want to look for is trajectory. How is someone growing and scaling? And what is their narrative going to be? And so when you think about growth, for a team member, you want to figure out who is going to be not just a great team member now, but who's going to continue growing with you and the organization, especially for a high growth company. So we started off with a series of psychometric tests that were, out of the box, like looking to better understand aptitude and problem solving ability. And then on our own tried to decipher passion, like existing interest. Like, do they show an interest in pushing themselves, like grit, perseverance? Like, these are the kind of things that we initially did. Now, I mean, at this point, applicants to Andela will, over the course of the application, complete 64 different assessments. It's a very complex, data-driven process, which we've been able to do because we've had, over 50,000 applicants over the past 2.5 years. Which we've been able to track not just the data from those that have, entered the program, but also how those people have then progressed once they've been accepted and how they've done once they've begun working with companies. Andela has this strange ability to look at data throughout that entire life cycle in a way that very few companies, organizations get a chance to. We're able to literally improve the selection process with data from how people go through the simulated, process while they're working on Andela internal projects, where you're able to use that to then better identify which companies they should be working with, what kind of engineering teams they should be working with, what their personality is going to be like, and then feed all of that back into the selection. And so it creates this almost fully formed thought in a way that most just don't have the ability to. I would look at this selection of Andela a little bit less like what most companies do, and a little bit more like the way that the NBA or Major League Baseball does selection. It's not about going and interviewing someone in high school and saying, do you think you're going to be a great baseball player? Tell me why you want to be a great baseball player. You're collecting data throughout. You're looking at how they do in college. You're looking at single A, double A, triple A. You're able to see progression. And you're able to use that to better understand where someone is going to be and then select based on thousands of data points, as opposed to a single moment in time and a couple people trying to make a semi-educated guess in 30 minutes.
So if you're giving advice to a new startup founder that's maybe starting to scale up their team and make some key hires, what are some things maybe you think they should stop doing that they're probably doing today, or start doing that they're not doing?
So looking at how we assess, the advice I'd give to a founder starting right now is that yes, there's a lot you can do once you collect a ton of data, but if this is your fourth hire, it's pretty tough to use those data points, understand predictively what's going to succeed versus what won't. Instead, I would just look at what are take the human component out of it. What are the 5 things you need this role to be able to achieve? And then for the applicants for that role, just rate them on how they would do those individual things, as opposed to whether or not you think they're the right person for it. The problem with the human component is that we are hopelessly biased as people, hopelessly. And we generally make assessments on ability and whether someone would be right for the role before they even open their mouth. And the limitations of that are wildly obvious, but you can easily start to understand how that creates systemic challenges for finding the right person for a job, and also ignoring so many extraordinary people that may not look like your conception of what an engineer looks like, but would be a phenomenal team member.
So there's probably a number of mental hurdles that the companies need to get through to start participating. One, I'm sure, is just the geographical distance in many cases, and having team members that are that remote. And so, how do you address that? And then, obviously, Andela is also distributed. And so, how do you operate internally, and what lessons have you learned?
The way that we look at it, and I think this is where the world of tech is certainly going, is that location is very similar to, have you ever, when's the last time you were at a 10-year-old's bowling birthday party? You see those bumpers, in the
8-year-olds
lanes?
pretty recently. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So they've got those bumpers in the lanes that prevent the balls from going into the gutters. Being in person is a little bit like bowling with bumpers. It doesn't make you a better, as a manager, it doesn't make you a better manager, but it helps you avoid stupid mistakes. And so if you're just starting, it helps you avoid the gutters. But if you're a pro, it has no impact whatsoever on what you do and how you do it. Management is very, very similar. If you're running a great agile process, you just care less about where someone is. You're able to have that 9 a.m. stand-up with people who are all over the world and get the exact same thing out of it. And you're able to manage the flow and process and communication in a way that enables everyone to know what's going on. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. But at this point, GitHub is half distributed. Stack Overflow is half distributed. Automatic, which is the parent company of WordPress, they power 25% of every website on the internet. They're the only company that I can actually talk about websites in terms of market share. And they're entirely distributed. They don't do that because they have to be. They do it because they realize it's actually a strategic advantage for them. At this point, 12% of developers in the US are entirely distributed. About a third of developers work from home at least 1 day a month. This is continuing to grow over time, and it's pretty simple why. It's because as you're better able to quantify the output of a developer, you just care more about getting the best person than you do about where they happen to be located. And as you care more about getting the best person, it starts to make sense to open the radius from the 20 miles around your office to the world. And so we're in many ways helping companies see that, but most of our partners were aware of that before, and we end up helping them either scale their existing distributed teams, or for most of them, help them move into that world that they've already been interested in, but it's tough to figure out how do you select the right person? How do you go about the process of managing? How do you go about the transition to thinking of distributed as a strategic advantage for you? And we help enable that for companies, while also then providing, that talent.
So I know Andela developers do spend a little time with the company in person and then before returning to Africa to work. What's the purpose of that visit, and sort of what types of things do you want to happen during that time?
Yeah, it's one of the unique and I think underappreciated components of how Andela operates. We actually require that our partners, if they have one, if they're not entirely distributed themselves, we require them to have a 2-week in-person orientation with their developers, where they're just working side by side. They don't have to plan out anything fancy, although a bunch of our partners get excited about it. But they just need to spend some face time. And the reason is that I believe trust is actually a very meaningful variable in the efficiency of teams. And you can build trust in a distributed fashion, but it just takes longer. There's still something about being in person. Now, fast forward 10 years and you and I are going to be, sitting in something that feels like the Matrix and able to have this conversation with virtual reality that allows us, even if we're on opposite coasts, to feel like we're face to face. At that point, all bets are off. And, you probably need even less of that FaceTime, but as it stands, it's just a really useful thing for teamwork. And Andela is a boutique environment. Like, we're focused on quality much more than like the quantity of people that can come through it. This is the next generation of tech leaders, period. And so we think that building those strong relationships and ensuring that teams function really effectively is such a critically important thing.
So I've heard the Andela team talk about talent being gender neutral. How do you think about diversity, both for your cohorts and then internally in Andela? And how do you seek it out, and how do you help it?
I think people deeply misunderstand diversity. The way that we look at it, and we do spend a lot of time focused on gender diversity in tech. I mean, going back to that same Stack Overflow survey, just because the data is so useful, I believe it was 5.7% of developers were women, like, around the world. Like, at the big five tech companies, it's about 6%. Like, it's kind of the same. It's abysmal. At Andela, we're about 25% female developers, and our target is 35. We're working on it. It definitely takes time and energy. But you look at men and women in the program, there's no difference in outcomes. There's no difference in ability whatsoever. And yes, we would focus on it. At least we would pay real attention to it no matter what, because we think it's the right thing to do. But that's not why diversity is going to win. The reason why diversity is going to win is the exact same reason that the single most effective way that you can improve the performance of a Fortune 500 company, single simplest way, is put more women on the board. Why is that? Is it that women are smarter than men? Nah, probably not. Maybe, but probably not. What's probably happening is that we all see the world through the lens of our own experiences. And that means we're all kind of like the blind people touching the different parts of the elephant, trying to figure out what it is. Like, we're trying to solve problems that have never been solved before. Like, that's what makes it hard and interesting. And if you're trying to come up with creative solutions, then being able to see the world through different vantage points is probably a really useful thing. And so if you look at like how teams are built throughout history, like, diverse teams always win. Why is Silicon Valley so successful? Because we've been able to convince some of the smartest and most driven people from all over the world to all come there to try to solve problems together. It's wildly diverse. And somehow this just gets lost in the conversation. And so we focus on gender diversity because it actually creates a better experience for the men that are Andela developers also. Everyone is better off by virtue of us focusing on it. But because of existing societal constructs that tell women that they shouldn't be in tech, there just aren't as many that obviously flock to it. And so you have to create systems that counterbalance that in order to have that benefit for the men in the program. Like, it's for everyone. Everyone is better off. And you look at that then through the lens of racial diversity as well, it's the same thing. Like, ultimately, you will solve problems more effectively by having different people coming together to try to tackle it. Look at Andela as a story. Like, you look at our founding team, 2 Nigerians, a Cameroonian, Canadian, and 2 Americans. Wildly different people from wildly different backgrounds. Each grew up in those countries. None of us individually would have been able to build this on our own. But by coming together to think of this as a problem that had lots of different facets that we were trying to understand, we've been able in 3 years to, we're more than 500 people in one of the fastest growing companies anywhere related to what we're doing in the world. Like, that's not an accident, and that's certainly not me. Like, that is a combination of different people coming together. And so the gender diversity, like racial diversity, it's all the same thing. Like, what matters is bringing different people with different backgrounds together to try to solve problems. And that's also the reason why I think it's a huge hot button issue right now in Silicon Valley. But the reason it's going to win is because teams will win that are more diverse.
We spoke a bunch about sort of what went well in the early days. I'm sure there are some things that didn't go as well. Were there times when you were like, oh, maybe this isn't going to work? Were there certain challenges that you ran into early on that were pretty serious?
So the way that I look at startups is the first couple of years are almost entirely just existential challenges. Like everything you do is make or break. It hopefully doesn't always seem like that, but the reality is you're just trying to struggle to prove to the world that you should exist. And this new thing should stick around. Luckily we were able to get through that faster than most. But yeah, I'd say the first year, the core concept of brilliance being evenly distributed, our team couldn't have believed that more strongly. We couldn't have been more embedded. But it doesn't mean that operational excellence isn't critically important to bringing that to life. And so we had to really dig down. In many ways, having a pretty strong mission orientation has actually been challenging, has actually made it harder in a bunch of ways, because you think about companies we work with, they don't work with us because they care about building the next generation of tech leaders around the world. That's not what they're trying to do. They have their own mission to solve, and their mission is really important, and we get to fulfill ours by ensuring that they're successful at theirs, period. And so we are not just aware of that, but we have to help people see that we are aware of that we are actually very proud of the value we deliver for them because of what it then allows us to do in terms of the mission and growth of Andela.
I can say that we certainly consider Andela a very interesting company, and can't wait to see what the future holds.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you for the time, and I'm glad to be able to share some of our stories.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Rob.
Goodbye, everyone.
That was the conversation with Jeremy Johnson and Rob Veris. Thanks so much, Jeremy, for joining the show and sharing so much of your insights. If you'd like to learn more about Jeremy and the team at Andela, visit andela.com, ANDELA.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please write a review on iTunes and let us know what you think on Twitter at Omidyar Network. Be sure to subscribe and visit our website, omidyar.com, to learn more. Thanks for listening to Founders Corner, and we'll see you next time.